On the 5th of March in 1943, something extraordinary happened in a dusty command post in Tunisia, something that would expose the dark machinery behind military promotions and political survival during World War II. Major General Lloyd Fredendall stood across from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, and the air between them was thick with unspoken truths. Eisenhower had flown in personally, not to congratulate or strategize, but to deliver a message that would shatter Fredendall's combat career in a single conversation. "You're relieved of command, effective immediately." The words were delivered with cold professionalism, the kind of tone that leaves no room for argument or explanation. Tomorrow, Major General George Patton Jr. would take over 2nd Corps, and Fredendall would be on a plane back to Algiers, then onward to Washington. There was no written order, no formal ceremony, just a verbal directive that carried the weight of absolute authority. Eisenhower didn't need to explain why, because both men knew exactly what had happened. Just 2 weeks earlier, Fredendall's corps had been absolutely shattered at Kasserine Pass in what became the worst American defeat of the entire North African campaign. Thousands of American soldiers had become casualties, entire units had broken apart and fled in pure panic, and the German forces had proved something terrifying to the Allied command, that American troops were not yet ready to face battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans. But what made this failure even more devastating was Fredendall's response in those 2 weeks following the disaster. He had spent every single day pointing fingers at everyone except the man staring back at him in the mirror. His subordinate commanders were incompetent, he claimed. The intelligence reports were inadequate and misleading. The troops were too green, too inexperienced, and they had panicked under fire like frightened children. Every excuse imaginable came pouring out, but never once did Fredendall look inward and accept responsibility for his catastrophic command decisions. Eisenhower's decision to relieve him made crystal clear what he thought of those explanations. They were worthless. So Fredendall packed his belongings in silence, believing with absolute certainty that his military career was finished, destroyed, over. He had no idea that what was coming next would be far more shocking than any court-martial or public disgrace. He had no idea he was about to fail upward into one of the most cynical promotions in American military history. Let's rewind the clock just a few weeks to understand how this disaster unfolded. On February 14, 1943, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox himself, launched a devastating attack through Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia. The objective was brutally simple: smash through the American defensive lines, capture their supply depots, and prove to the world that American forces couldn't stand toe-to-toe with German veterans who had been fighting since 1939. Fredendall's 2nd Corps was responsible for defending a 70-mile front with roughly 30,000 men. But those men weren't concentrated into a cohesive defensive force. They were scattered in small, isolated groups across the desert landscape, separated by miles of empty terrain. Commanders had received conflicting orders that left them confused about their actual mission. The defensive line had gaps so large that entire panzer divisions could drive through them without encountering any resistance whatsoever. When Rommel's forces attacked, American positions didn't just bend, they collapsed within hours like a house of cards in a windstorm. Entire battalions broke formation and ran. Equipment worth millions of dollars was abandoned where it stood. Soldiers fled in vehicles, on foot, in complete and utter panic, and by February 22nd, the Germans had advanced 50 miles into American-held territory. American casualties exceeded 6,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or left behind for the Germans to capture and study. It was one of the worst American defeats of World War II, And here's the part that makes your blood boil. Lloyd Fredendall had been nowhere near the fighting. While his men were dying under German artillery and panzer attacks, Fredendall had built himself a command post in a remote canyon far behind the front lines. Most accounts place it somewhere between 80 to 100 miles from the forward positions where the actual battle was taking place. He had ordered a company of engineers to spend over 3 weeks blasting this elaborate underground headquarters out of solid rock, while his frontline troops were digging shallow foxholes with their bare hands and entrenching tools, with no overhead cover to protect them from artillery shells. Think about that image for just a moment. While engineers were setting off dynamite charges to carve out Fredendall's personal fortress in what the troops bitterly nicknamed Speedy Valley, his soldiers were hearing a very different kind of explosion echoing across the desert. The sound of German 88mm guns tearing through thin American armor like tissue paper. One man was building a fortress to protect himself from a war he refused to get close to. His soldiers were digging their own graves with shallow foxholes in the frozen Tunisian mud, exposed and vulnerable. Fredendall rarely visited forward units, rarely saw his men face to face, rarely witnessed the conditions they were fighting and dying in. He gave orders by telephone to commanders he had never personally met, commanders who were trying desperately to make sense of contradictory instructions while under fire. When Eisenhower visited on February 20th to personally assess the disaster unfolding in Tunisia, what he saw convinced him that Fredendall had to go, not just relieved from command, but removed immediately before he could cause even more damage to American forces and morale. George Patton landed in Tunisia on March 6, 1943, and his arrival marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation. He had been commanding forces in Morocco when Eisenhower called with urgent orders. Take command of 2nd Corps, fix what's broken, and do it fast. Patton arrived wearing his trademark polished boots and ivory-handled pistols, with an expression on his face that barely contained his fury at what he was inheriting. He immediately began touring every single unit in the Corps, getting his eyes on the ground situation that Fredendall had ignored. He fired commanders on the spot if they didn't meet his standards. He enforced strict uniform regulations that Fredendall had allowed to slide into casual disarray. He visited frontline positions that Fredendall had never bothered to see with his own eyes, and within just 2 weeks, 2nd Corps was transformed into a completely different fighting force. Discipline replaced chaos and confusion. Aggressive patrolling replaced defensive cowering and fear. The exact same soldiers who had broken and run at Kasserine Pass were now stopping German attacks cold and beginning to win engagements against the enemy. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious or more damning. Same units, same equipment, same enemy, but completely different results. The only variable that had changed was leadership at the top. Patton wrote in his personal diary that Fredendall's command arrangements were the worst he had ever seen in his entire military career, and this was a man who had served since World War I. The elaborate underground headquarters, the scattered and isolated units, the complete absence of any forward command presence. It was nothing less than professional malpractice in Patton's eyes. But Patton also noticed something else that troubled him deeply. Fredendall had already left Tunisia by the time Patton arrived. He was on a plane headed to Algiers, then Washington, and nobody in the command structure was talking openly about what would happen to him once he got there. Lloyd Fredendall's flight from Tunisia to Washington took 3 full days with stops in Algiers and Morocco for refueling. He traveled alone except for his personal aide. No ceremonies, no press coverage, just a quiet removal from the theater of operations. The plane finally landed at Bolling Field outside Washington on March 16, 1943, and Fredendall stepped off expecting to face the consequences of his failure. He expected to be met by stern War Department officials, possibly even military police. He expected investigations, formal hearings, possibly even a court-martial that would destroy his reputation and end his career in public disgrace. What he got instead shocked him to his core and revealed just how deeply political considerations trumped military accountability. A military band was playing cheerful music. Reporters were waiting with cameras ready to capture his arrival. A War Department car was positioned on the tarmac, ready to drive him to an official welcome ceremony. Fredendall stepped off that plane expecting the cold steel of military justice, and instead he was hit by the brassy, upbeat notes of a military band playing as if he were a returning hero. To anyone who knew the truth about Kasserine Pass, that music must have sounded like a funeral dirge for military accountability itself. The official story released to the press was carefully worded to avoid any hint of failure or disgrace. Major General Fredendall had returned from North Africa after distinguished service in combat operations. He would be assuming new duties commensurate with his experience and rank. There was no mention of being fired for incompetence, no reference to the disaster at Kasserine Pass, no explanation of why a corps commander had suddenly left his command in the middle of an active campaign. This was the beginning of a cover-up that would expose the darkest side of military politics during World War II. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, was facing an impossible situation of his own making. Marshall had built the United States Army from a tiny force of roughly 200,000 men in 1939 to millions of soldiers by 1943. He had personally selected commanders, designed training programs, and created the entire mobilization system that was now fighting across multiple theaters of war. His reputation was built on two pillars: competence and accountability. But Fredendall's failure at Kasserine threatened to bring that entire reputation crashing down, because Marshall had personally selected Fredendall for Corps Command. Within days of Fredendall's return to Washington, a remarkable narrative began to emerge in official channels. Fredendall was described as a combat veteran with valuable experience gained under fire. His insights would be invaluable for training new armies that were still being mobilized and prepared for deployment. Reporters who tried to ask specific questions about what had happened at Kasserine Pass were politely deflected with the explanation that operational details couldn't be discussed for security reasons while the war was still ongoing. But the truth was far simpler and far more damning. Fredendall's failure at Kasserine was also Marshall's failure, because Marshall had chosen him. Now Marshall faced a choice that would define his integrity. He could court-martial Fredendall and admit publicly that his judgment in selecting commanders had been catastrophically wrong, or he could quietly shove Fredendall into a position where he couldn't do any more damage and hope the whole mess would fade from public memory. Marshall chose the second option, but there was a significant complication he hadn't anticipated. Fredendall had powerful friends in Congress, representatives and senators from his home state, who were already asking pointed questions about why he had been brought home from combat command. They wanted assurances that his service was being properly recognized, and that he wasn't being made a scapegoat for institutional failures beyond his control. Marshall faced an awkward situation that was about to get even more awkward. Back in November 1942, before the disaster at Kasserine Pass had even happened, Eisenhower had recommended Fredendall for promotion to lieutenant general. That recommendation was sitting in the War Department bureaucracy awaiting approval, and now Marshall had to decide whether to proceed with promoting a general who had just been fired for catastrophic incompetence. In a decision that would haunt the Army's reputation for decades, Marshall decided to proceed with the promotion. Fredendall would be promoted to lieutenant general and assigned to command 2nd Army, a training organization in the United States where he couldn't harm combat operations. The promotion would move forward as if Kasserine had never happened, as if thousands of American casualties were just an unfortunate footnote in an otherwise distinguished career. When Eisenhower heard that the promotion recommendation he'd made months earlier was actually going forward, he was stunned into silence. He had just personally fired Fredendall for incompetence that had gotten American soldiers killed, and now Marshall was promoting him to 3-star rank. On June 1, 1943, Lloyd Fredendall was promoted to lieutenant general in a ceremony at the War Department with full military honors. Marshall himself pinned on the 3rd star in front of assembled officers and officials. The official citation praised Fredendall's leadership in North Africa, his combat experience, and his contributions to developing American tactical doctrine against German forces. It made absolutely no mention of Kasserine Pass. It contained not even the slightest hint that he had been relieved of command in disgrace less than 5 weeks earlier. Fredendall was now wearing the same rank as George Patton, the man who had salvaged the disaster in Tunisia and rebuilt Second Corps into an effective fighting force. The general who caused the catastrophe wore the exact same 3 stars as the general who had fixed it. The promotion announcement reached Tunisia within days through Stars and Stripes newspaper, and officers who had served under Fredendall's failed command read the news with disbelief and barely contained fury. Imagine being a sergeant in the 1st Armored Division, sitting in the dust of a combat camp, holding a greasy copy of Stars and Stripes in your hands. You see the photograph of the man who sent your friends to die while he hid in a bunker miles away, and above his head is a shiny new 3rd star. That wasn't just a promotion, it was a middle finger to every man who had actually bled and died in Kasserine Pass. But perhaps the bitterest reaction came from Patton himself, the man who had cleaned up Fredendall's mess. Patton had just finished court-martialing officers for their failures at Kasserine. He had relieved commanders for not being aggressive enough, for not visiting frontline positions, for command arrangements that scattered forces instead of concentrating them. Fredendall had done all of these things on a massive, systematic scale, and his reward was a 3rd star and a comfortable posting in the United States. While that 3rd star was being pinned on in Washington, angry letters started reaching the War Department from officers still fighting in Tunisia. Fredendall had been assigned to command 2nd Army, a training organization in Memphis, Tennessee, which meant he would never see combat again for the rest of the war. The anger in those letters was raw and unfiltered. How could the general directly responsible for the worst American defeat of the entire war be promoted while his subordinate officers were being court-martialed and cashiered? Why were the men who had simply followed his orders being destroyed while he wore 3 stars and gave lectures in Memphis? Marshall's response was always the same carefully worded statement. General Fredendall's record speaks for itself. His current assignment makes the best use of his experience and abilities, and personnel decisions are based on the needs of the service. What Marshall couldn't say publicly was the ugly truth behind the decision. Fredendall's congressional connections made firing him or disgracing him publicly a politically dangerous move. His powerful friends in Wyoming had made it crystal clear that any public disgrace or court-martial would trigger congressional investigations and embarrassing hearings. So Marshall chose to shield the institution rather than pursue justice, but this decision established a precedent that would haunt the Army for the rest of the war. Political connections could now protect incompetent generals from facing the consequences of their catastrophic failures. The contrast with other Kasserine commanders made Fredendall's promotion even more grotesque and offensive. Major General Orlando Ward had commanded the 1st Armored Division under Fredendall at Kasserine, and Ward had actually protested Fredendall's orders to scatter his division across 70 miles of desert terrain. He had warned clearly and repeatedly that these dispositions were completely indefensible against a concentrated attack. Fredendall had overruled him with the arrogance of a man who thought he knew better. When the German attack finally came crashing through, Ward's scattered units were defeated in detail exactly as he had predicted they would be. Ward fought desperately to contain the breakthrough, moving constantly between isolated units and trying to organize some kind of coherent defense out of the chaos. After Kasserine, Patton relieved Ward in early April 1943 during the follow-up Battle of El Getter. Patton felt that Ward had become too cautious and traumatized by the disaster that Fredendall's orders had created. Ward was reassigned to administrative duties, and though he later returned to combat command with the 20th Armored Division in 1945 and had a distinguished post-war career, the relief effectively ended his wartime command trajectory at the precise moment when Fredendall was being promoted to 3 stars. The purge of Kasserine-era officers continued systematically even after the Army started winning under Patton's aggressive leadership. Regimental commanders who had simply followed Fredendall's orders were court-martialed for the failures those orders had caused. Battalion commanders were relieved for not holding positions that Fredendall's dispositions had made impossible to defend. These officers had no congressional protection. They had no political connections powerful enough to save their careers, and they paid the full price while Fredendall was being promoted and celebrated. Patton watched this grotesque injustice unfold with mounting disgust. He was a man who believed deeply in an ancient warrior code of honor and accountability. To Patton, Fredendall wasn't just a bad general who had made mistakes. He was a fundamental sin against the entire profession of arms. Every time Patton had to salute a man like Fredendall or see him wearing the same 3 stars, it was a bitter reminder that even in the middle of a world-ending war, the Old Boys Club remained the one thing that was absolutely bulletproof. Patton told his staff bluntly that the Army was punishing exactly the wrong people. The Corps commander who had caused the disaster was safe in Tennessee wearing 3 stars and teaching tactics. The division and regimental commanders who had tried desperately to salvage his catastrophic mistakes were being destroyed and cashiered. It was a brutal lesson about military politics that Patton never forgot for the rest of his career. Competence mattered far less than political connections. Taking personal responsibility was career suicide, and blame could always be deflected downward as long as you had the right friends in Washington. Dwight Eisenhower watched Fredendall's promotion from North Africa with carefully maintained public silence. But his private feelings were far more complex. He had personally recommended Fredendall's relief from command. He had sent Patton to fix the disaster. He knew exactly how badly Fredendall had failed and how many American lives that failure had cost. But Eisenhower didn't just stay silent about the promotion. He actively participated in the cover-up. He wrote to marshals supporting the idea of giving Fredendall a hero's welcome when he returned to the United States. His reasoning was brutally political rather than militarily sound. If the American public learned that a Corps commander had been fired for incompetence that got thousands of soldiers killed, it would destroy national morale and confidence in the Army's leadership. Better to hide the failure and protect the institution than risk public confidence in the war effort. Eisenhower never protested the promotion decision. He didn't write dissenting memos or make his opposition known through official channels. He expressed his true views only to his immediate staff in private conversations. Years later, Eisenhower's chief of staff explained the reasoning behind this silence. Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander in a theater where American, British, and French forces all had to work together despite massive cultural and strategic differences. He couldn't afford to start a political war with the War Department over personnel decisions, no matter how unjust those decisions might be. If he challenged Marshall's handling of the Fredendall situation, he would create powerful enemies in Washington who could undermine his authority in the theater and make coalition warfare even more difficult than it already was. So Eisenhower made a cold calculation that prioritized his own survival and operational authority. He would work within the system rather than fight against it, no matter how corrupt that system had become. This decision would fundamentally shape his command style for the rest of World War II. When other generals failed in combat, Eisenhower would relieve them quietly, reassign them to non-combat positions away from the press, and let the War Department handle all the public relations spin. He would never again try to hold failed commanders publicly accountable for their mistakes. The lesson was absolutely clear. Military competence and tactical skill mattered far less than political survival, and Eisenhower chose to survive rather than fight for principle. The real explanation for Fredendall's promotion wasn't military merit or valuable experience. It was pure congressional politics, and the smoking gun evidence was hidden in a family tree that most people had never bothered to examine closely. Fredendall's family had deep, intertwined connections to Wyoming's political machinery going back decades. His father had been a personal protege of Senator Francis Warren of Wyoming, one of the most powerful politicians in the state's history. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Senator Warren was the father-in-law of General John Pershing, the legendary commander of American forces in World War I. This tangled family tree of military and political power made Fredendall essentially untouchable to the War Department. Marshall himself had been General Pershing's former aide and protege during World War I, which meant he had personal and professional ties to the same network that protected Fredendall. He couldn't easily move against a man whose family was so closely connected to Pershing's own father-in-law without risking those relationships. When word reached Washington that Fredendall might be court-martialed or publicly disgraced for his failures, those powerful relationships activated like a well-oiled machine. Phone calls were made directly to senior War Department officials. Private meetings were quietly requested with Marshall himself. Questions began being asked in congressional committees about whether General Fredendall was being made an unfair scapegoat for broader institutional failures in training doctrine and preparation. Marshall understood the threat immediately and completely. Congressional investigations into North African Command decisions could potentially expose systemic problems across the entire mobilization system, and the disaster at Kasserine Pass had many fathers beyond just Fredendall. The troops had been insufficiently trained. The doctrine had been untested against veteran German forces. The intelligence had failed to predict the timing and location of Rommel's attack. Making Fredendall the sole scapegoat could trigger exhaustive investigations that would embarrass everyone involved, from the War Department down to division-level commanders. So Marshall made a cynical but pragmatic calculation. Better to quietly promote Fredendall, assign him to a training command where he couldn't do any more combat damage, and simply move on. The American public would never learn the details of what really happened. The Army would maintain its carefully cultivated image of competence and accountability. Congressional friends would be satisfied that their man was being treated fairly and with proper recognition. It was pure political calculation masquerading as personnel management, and it worked absolutely perfectly for everyone except the soldiers who had died. Fredendall kept his 3 stars, his generous pension, and his intact reputation. The Army successfully avoided congressional investigations that could have exposed systemic failures. Marshall avoided having to publicly admit that his judgment in selecting commanders had been catastrophically wrong. Everyone won except the thousands of soldiers who had become casualties at Kasserine Pass, and the competent officers whose careers were systematically destroyed for failures that weren't their fault. Fredendall spent the rest of World War II at Second Army in Memphis, training infantry divisions for deployment to Europe and the Pacific. By all accounts, he was adequate at this job, which required administrative competence and organizational skills rather than battlefield judgment and tactical brilliance. No major scandals emerged from his headquarters during this period. The training programs ran smoothly and divisions were prepared and shipped out on schedule. But everyone who served under him at Second Army knew his real history, and they understood that the third star on his shoulder was political protection rather than earned achievement through merit. The cynicism this situation created spread like poison through the entire officer corps. Combat veterans who had just survived Rommel's attacks in North Africa found themselves sitting in Memphis classrooms, while Fredendall stood at the front lecturing them confidently about modern tactics and battlefield leadership. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone in those rooms, and the bitter irony was discussed quietly in officers' clubs across the training command. Some officers later credited Fredendall with teaching them genuinely valuable lessons, but not the lessons he intended to teach. His catastrophic failures at Kasserine Pass became detailed case studies in exactly how not to organize defensive positions, how not to command from the rear, how not to scatter forces across indefensible terrain. In a twisted way that he never understood or intended, Fredendall's greatest contribution to the American war effort was serving as a perfect example of catastrophic leadership failure. Officers studied exactly what he had done wrong in Tunisia and resolved never to repeat those same mistakes when they took their own units into combat. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender, and the war in the Pacific ended in August after the atomic bombings. Fredendall remained at Second Army until June 1946, then retired at the rank of lieutenant general with full military honors and ceremony. His official biography listed him as a distinguished combat veteran who had served his country with honor and dedication through a long career. The Kasserine disaster was mentioned only briefly in official Army histories published after the war. Most accounts focused primarily on Rommel's tactical brilliance and the understandable inexperience of American troops facing German veterans for the first time. Fredendall's name appeared in footnotes and passing references, not in entire chapters examining command failure. He lived quietly in California for nearly 2 decades until his death in 1963 at age 79. He never wrote memoirs about his experiences or gave interviews to historians about what had happened at Kasserine Pass. He never publicly addressed his relief from command or the controversial promotion that followed. He took whatever private thoughts and regrets he might have had to his grave. But other commanders were far less silent about what had happened. Omar Bradley's 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story, contained one absolutely devastating paragraph about Fredendall that pulled no punches. Bradley wrote bluntly that Fredendall had lived in an elaborate command post blasted out of solid rock 80 miles behind the front lines while his troops lived exposed in shallow foxholes. He described how Fredendall had commanded entirely by telephone rather than personal presence at the front, and he stated clearly that the decision to relieve him was completely justified and necessary. Patton's personal wartime diaries, which were published after his death in a 1945 car accident, were even more brutally honest. While Bradley had estimated the bunker was 80 miles from the fighting, Patton, never a man known for understatement, recorded it as a full 100 miles from the men who were actually doing the dying. He called Fredendall a coward who sent men to die in battle while building himself an elaborate personal bunker for safety. He called the promotion an absolute disgrace to the military service and everything it was supposed to represent. His official reports written during the war had been far more diplomatically restrained to maintain proper military decorum, but his private diaries revealed his true contempt. Eisenhower's post-war memoirs were characteristically more diplomatic in tone, but equally damning in substance. He wrote that Fredendall's relief from command had been absolutely necessary for the good of the service and the success of future operations. He described the decision as one of the most clear-cut command decisions of the entire war. But none of these post-war accounts and memoirs changed the fundamental historical fact that Fredendall had retired as a three-star general with a comfortable pension and protected reputation, while objectively better officers had been destroyed and cashiered for far lesser failures. In the late 1950s, George Marshall was interviewed extensively by his official biographer, Forrest Pogue, about his wartime decisions as Army Chief of Staff. Pogue naturally asked about the controversial Fredendall promotion and why Marshall had allowed it to proceed. Marshall's answer was extremely revealing about his priorities. Marshall defended the decision entirely on institutional grounds rather than individual merit. He argued that destroying Fredendall publicly through court-martial proceedings would have required exposing in exhaustive detail just how unprepared American forces had actually been in early 1943. The troops were inexperienced and green. The tactical doctrine was largely untested against veteran opponents. The training programs had clearly failed to prepare units for combat against German forces who had been fighting since 1939. Promoting Fredendall into a training role effectively masked the fact that the entire mobilization system had been inadequately prepared for the reality of modern combat. It protected the institution's reputation with the public and Congress, while simultaneously removing Fredendall from any position where he could cause further combat damage. Marshall never explicitly said he regretted the decision or would have handled it differently, but the distinctly defensive tone in his answers suggested he understood the moral cost. The consequences of this cynical compromise echoed through the rest of World War II and beyond. It established a clear system where catastrophic failure could be survived and even rewarded with political protection, while ambitious officers learned the hard lesson that cultivating congressional relationships and political connections mattered just as much as tactical skill and battlefield competence. It created a military culture where failure could lead to promotion while success remained entirely optional, where political connections mattered infinitely more than the lives of dead soldiers, where the system consistently protected the guilty and systematically punished the innocent. And who paid the ultimate price for this corruption? The soldiers themselves. At Kasserine Pass, over 6,000 American soldiers became casualties directly because of Fredendall's incompetent command decisions and refusal to visit the front. After the war ended, the families of those casualties learned through newspaper reports and books that the general directly responsible for their sons' deaths had been promoted to 3 stars, while their boys were buried in military cemeteries in North Africa. We often talk about political face-saving as if it's some kind of victimless crime that only affects careers and reputations. But every single star on Fredendall's shoulder was paid for in agonizing installments by families in Wyoming, Illinois, and New York who received telegrams that didn't offer promotions or congratulations. Those telegrams offered only a folded flag and a hollow thank you for their sacrifice. In Washington, powerful men saved a career and protected the institution. In North Africa, they simply filled another cemetery with young American bodies. The man directly responsible for the disaster at Kasserine Pass retired with full military honors, a 3-star general's comfortable pension, and a reputation carefully protected by the most powerful men in the United States Army. History is supposedly written by the winners, but sometimes it's also quietly edited by the people who are simply too embarrassed to admit they picked the wrong man for the job. Because in war, as Lloyd Fredendall's story proves beyond any doubt. Military competence is apparently negotiable, but political connections, those are forever.